I want to thank you all for joining us from around the world. My name is Gina Jerva. I am an attorney and manager of market insights and thought leadership here at the Thomson Reuters Institute. I will be your moderator today, and today we're going to be talking about the S in ESG, dispelling the myths. So what does that mean, and what are we going to talk about? Well, I think the whole reason we're here today is that how can companies really be more transparent about how they affect the planet and people? This is the question of the hour. Investors report that some of the greatest impediments to integrating social indicators into decision-making are related to data gaps and issues of inadequate data consistency, comparability, and scalability. While companies themselves have been reluctant to make disclosures on social performance, alternative data sources provide a way to address the data gap. So this will be a really timely conversation on the state of the industry to dispel those myths of the state of risk indicators for integrating into business and investment decisions. The webinar is really going to focus on what can be done to address the myths. So we're going to talk about what the myths are, and then we're going to look at solution-focused and action-oriented ways to help dispel those myths. And you will learn how investors can ensure sufficient and accurate coverage on S issues in emerging and frontier markets, how S data can be reported in accordance with various regulations that require disclosure of S indicators, and finally, what companies can do to help investors establish social performance assessments. And I am very excited to introduce my three distinguished panelists here. We'll start with Linda Zelina. She is the founder and CEO of International Sustainable Finance Center. And she is one of the authors of a new report, Amplifying the S in ESG, Investor Myth Buster. She's going to talk about the report. She's going to talk about how it was compiled. It was a truly group effort. So I'm very excited to hear more about that. And then we also have Alexandra Migalescu. I said that correctly, Executive Vice President, Sales and Marketing for RepRisk, to address closing the data gap in S with an overview of the RepRisk data and methodology. And Taylor Swissa, Research Project Manager for the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark at World Benchmarking Alliance. And she's going to showcase how the S data is used in research within the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. A couple other housekeeping notes. We will be getting to questions at the end of the session. We'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So please send your questions in via the chat. We will be monitoring them. We're going to get to as many as we can. We have quite a packed hour, so please send them in. And if we are not able to get to them today, we will follow up later, either via email or via a blog post with answers to some of the questions. So we'll start with each panelist is going to speak for about 10 minutes or so. They're going to give their presentation. We'll go through those, and then we'll get to the Q&A at the end. So other than that, if I am able, I'm going to turn it right over to we're going to start with Linda and go from there.
Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you, RepRisk, for hosting this fantastic session. And so I'm the CEO of ISFC, which stands for International Sustainable Finance Center. And today, I will actually tell you about how we created this paper and what were our findings, because this was a big group effort for almost a year, I think. Initially, we thought we would do a short paper, very simple, very investor-friendly. We kept it investor-friendly, but it isn't as short as we initially planned. So, next, please. So who are we and how did this group come together? What was the big idea behind it? So the group started meeting just when COVID-19 spread across the world and we entered a big lockdown. And we thought, well, if not now, when else are we going to start talking about all these social factors and societal issues now that we're all sitting at home thinking, this is not great. We tried to talk to multiple different organizations and figure out what they think. And in the end, we created this so-called working group, which was convened by Thomson Reuters Foundation, which managed to lead on this big effort. We were joined by UNPRI, by Refinitiv, now part of the London Stock Exchange Group, by White and Case, by Mekong Club, and also EcoAge. We also had RFK Human Rights from New York as an observing partner, and we were very lucky to also work with RepRisk in the end. So what did we do? We got together a working group and started thinking, well, what are the most common myths that we keep hearing from the investor community? And we realized that actually they're quite repetitive. So we started compiling a short list from our own experiences. Then we thought, well, maybe we should also talk to some people and double check that that's also what they're hearing. We constructed a tracker and we consulted over 100 different entities, experts from a variety of different sectors across the globe. So it was a real global effort to hear what people think are the main myths that investors hold about these issues. We, of course, also engaged with the investment community. And then we thought, well, what are the 5 realities? Maybe these myths are actually partially true. And we realized that actually there might be a small grain of truth in some of them, but the reality has really moved on. And then rather than just highlighting the issues and the realities, we thought, well, why don't we do something about it? So what would be the 5 actions we can recommend, the 5 first steps for each myth, each reality, what you as an investor can actually actively do? So these were the 5 myths, 5 realities, 5 actions. That's how we actually structured the paper. Next. These are the main findings. So this is what we actually found. So one of the biggest issues that we identified was that majority of investors were really, really concerned about the environmental factors because legislation is moving, regulation is moving, everybody talks about climate. You have a big conference around it, COP, that just happened in Glasgow. This is on the agenda and it really worries investors. However, when it came to social issues, we heard various reasons why, well, it's sometimes important, but, it's very limited in our focus because this is very political. It's the area where governments should be more active rather than us, the investors. Or in some cases, people were saying, well, listen, it's all very nice, but this is a field much more for impact investors because we do have to prioritize our returns. And well, what we also discovered through talking to academics and experts who had been monitoring this space, actually social indicators are material and they're becoming increasingly so, not just because of COVID, but because they're often not priced in. And they are quantifiable and measurable. The data space has moved on a lot, and I'm sure that our colleagues from RepRisk will also tell us how it's moved on. So you can actually find a lot of indicators and a lot of data around this space. So what we discovered is that even though majority of investors don't necessarily think that the social indicators or social issues are very material or will affect their returns, we discovered that actually in terms of what experience and what examples you can find, they are increasingly becoming very financially material. Of course, depending on the sector, you might have different materiality concerns, but nobody is spared from the materiality of the S. Second thing that we heard was, oh, well, but it's so difficult to get started. Like, where do you even start? It's like a minefield, whatever we do, it's never enough. We get criticized, so on and so forth. Well, with the guidelines on human rights, we actually have a very well-established link between business and human rights. We saw what happened in the case of Boohoo, where it actually affected returns and showed how human rights are very important to any kind of good business and good investment strategy. Then the next thing that we heard a lot about was the data. Well, you know what? S indicators, so hard to measure, almost unmeasurable. What we do is we do qualitative surveys. We try and look at whether businesses have a human rights policy, and we do look at a variety of different policy-related questions, but how else would you measure it? And now, actually, what we discovered is that there's many more indicators available, actually quantifiable indicators, and some of them will show whether these policies actually work in practice, because having a policy is very nice, but you also need to know whether it works, and you need to measure whether there are improvements. Then another thing we heard was we already do enough that was a very interesting one, because people were already aligned with certain standards, or they already had at least somebody working on the S. That was enough. We don't need to do more. And this is something that we want to really emphasize. Well, it's an evolving space, and there's almost never just a hard stop that you've done enough. There's always something else you can do, and there's always something that you need to monitor and improve. Because data-driven elements can be extremely useful, and with improving technologies and the growth in terms of the data points that get used, you can really get a much better, much more comprehensive understanding. And also, you can have what we call the red flag system, is that you can actually see where there might be something that you need to check. Maybe there's some data that indicates that something might not be going as well as the official reporting is showing. And yes, the final one is integration. We actually thought that it was very interesting that not everybody saw why it's profitable. And what we saw from some of the research, some of the experts we spoke, there are actually more and more instances where going for companies that have very good social practices and have embedded strong relationships with their employees, good human rights practices, that actually makes them a lot more resilient. Because in an uncertain world where we have a very disturbing situation with the war on Ukraine. So you never know. The world is very uncertain. And if you want at least a little bit less risk, you want to mitigate the risk and you want to sleep more peacefully at night, we do recommend that you definitely start looking at the S a bit closer. Because in terms of the actions, what it will do, number one, by identifying the material S factors and indicators for the sector that you're in, for your investable universe, you will definitely have a much more comprehensive, much more full understanding of the risk universe as well. And it will help you to build that resilience that everybody now searches in a very volatile world. Also, it's very important to use existing resources. Understanding how social performance is assessed is absolutely crucial. That will also help improve your practice. It will also help to review these indicators and use and demand more data. I think that is absolutely crucial, because the more data you use, the better it will be, because not all data is created equal, as I'm sure our colleagues will also explain. So it's very good if you have multiple sources, or you keep evolving and trying to figure out what additional factors you might need to look at. And it's a very good practice to combine data and analytical approaches, because that helps to understand the interlinkages between the S and the E and the S and the G, and actually understanding of how to improve and help, if you're an active investor, how to help companies to improve. And it's important to do that across both public and also private markets. It is important to do it both for debt and equity. There's a variety of spaces where you could really reach quite a lot of beneficial action with a bit more active approach. And again, you can also avoid missed opportunities, because there are some businesses that will be growing faster and better because they can scale up better, because they can retain and attract talent, which is becoming increasingly difficult. We hear from companies again and again, how do we retain and attract best talent in a world where preferences of the workforce are rapidly changing? So that is pretty much my 5 cents on what we did with our S and ESG paper. The working group, next please. The working group still exists. So I believe one of our colleagues has put the link to the paper in the chat. So please feel free to reach out to ask questions, and we will hopefully be continuing the work of the working group. We are not yet ready to disclose what might be the next big thing, but we do believe that at least the paper helped. It definitely ignited a conversation, and it definitely sparked the necessary investor attention, which was much necessary, especially in light of an increasingly uncertain and difficult world to navigate. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now we're going to turn to Alexandra.
Thanks, Gina. I'm very happy to be with you all today. So, yeah, I will reinforce, hopefully try to reinforce what Linda said, that we believe that we see in our work that the S is definitely measurable, and there is good data on S that investors and others can use. Before I jump into just a few data examples that I wanted to share on what we're seeing in our data set on the S in ESG, I first thought I could introduce a bit about RepRisk and what we do in our research approach to looking at ESG broadly, but specifically for today, the social issues. So RepRisk is an ESG data science firm. We provide qualitative research and quantitative data on ESG risks. So that risk lens is very important. It comes from our history. We came originally from a credit risk team at a global bank. And our RepRisk platform, the database that our clients use and our partners use, was launched back in 2006, first and foremost as a due diligence tool for the financial sector. So we started off with 100 companies that were exposed to environmental and human rights risks, and we've built that the database over the last 15 years. Today it has close to 200,000 companies, so ESG risk profiles of companies and infrastructure projects like mines and pipelines, where you can look up the different areas where a company is exposed, the issues, the countries, and so on. We're very proud to always say that we're the only ESG data provider to systematically cover private companies and companies in emerging and frontier markets. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about our methodology so we can understand how we actually look at this information and how we build the data set on ESG and again on S specifically. So first of all, our use case is very clear and simple. So we are focused on one thing. Everything that we do is focused on systematically identifying, assessing, and then monitoring ESG risks linked to companies and to infrastructure projects. So let me share the 4 key points on this slide about how we actually do that. So the first point I already mentioned. So we look at ESG exclusively through this risk lens. The second key point is that we are evaluating a company on ESG risks through an outside-in perspective. So what does that mean? That means that we do not look at company disclosures, company reporting, company policies. So basically, we're not looking at what the company itself is saying. Instead, we are looking at this outside perspective, external sources and stakeholders, such as media and NGOs, think tanks, regulators, governmental agencies. What do they have to say about how a company is managing human rights or occupational health and safety or any other S or ESG issue on the ground around the world where they operate? So we like to talk about it at RepRisk as a reality check, right? You have the information coming from the company. They have a human rights policy. They have various policies. And then we can show the data that complements that to say, okay, what's really happening on the ground? What are the details there? And then with that information, you get the full picture. So that is the outside-in perspective. And to do that, we screen over 100,000 sources every day in 23 languages. So it's really about going down to the local level and finding those incidents and those risks early. The third point is about the timeliness of data, which is always coming up as well as an issue. So we update our data on a daily basis. Our data goes back 15 years. So when we started back in 2006, official start 2007. So a lot of data to work with that organizations can use to do a historical view, to do due diligence, and then to monitor risks on an ongoing basis. I think the key point about our methodology is that it's rules-based and that it's transparent. And I think that's something that the market has been asking for, stakeholders have been asking for. So you can go to our website today and see our entire methodology published. You can even see our definitions of all the issues that we cover. I think that's an important point to mention. And the work that we do, the fourth and final point on our methodology, is basically about how we actually do this work. And for that, we combine technology. So we leverage AI, machine learning, and we combine that together with a human analyst team. So the technology does the heavy lifting, so to speak. They help us to screen all those sources and all the languages. And then the analysts are essentially the curators. They make sure that what gets analyzed and then in the hands of the clients is relevant and actionable according to our methodology. So that's the key points that I wanted to mention about how we're looking at this data and how we're building the data set. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the S in ESG. So for us, I think, like I said, the important thing to get quality data on S or anything in the ESG space is having a clear use case and having a transparent methodology. So we think that is the recipe for having meaningful, actionable data. So when it comes to S, so our research scope covers all the S issues that you would expect: occupational health and safety, child labor, forced labor, and the way that we define those issues is in line with how all the key international standards out there. And then we have granular data. So beyond the issues, if users want to look at more granular points, they're something that we call topic tags. So looking not just at human rights, which is a very big issue, very broad issue, but looking then at human trafficking or migrant labor, looking at gender equality or racism and racial inequality. So there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice the data. Good, so I think if we look at our data set over the last 2 years, we did a quick analysis over the last 2 years, is that almost 50% of the companies in the database, so 34,000 companies in the last 2 years have been exposed to an S issue. And 10% of forced labor and 19% of child labor incidents were also linked to the governance issue of misleading communication. So that we thought that was interesting to note, mostly because there's a lot of talk about greenwashing, but there's also some discrepancies also in the social side. So where maybe what companies are saying about how they're handling S issues, social issues, and maybe the reality is different. So again, it's trying to figure out who's walking their talk. If we look a little bit further and we dig into those companies that had an exposure on social risks in the last 2 years, those 47%, if we look a little bit further, we see the top 3 issues that have been are prevalent in the last 2 years are impact of communities, so local impacts on communities, occupational health and safety, and poor employment conditions. So those are the 3 most prevalent ones. A bit surprised, I think some of us were surprised when we were doing the analysis, like the forced and child labor were less prevalent. Those tend to be very salient issues that a lot of people are talking about, but we don't see that in the data. And I think part of it's maybe there's a lot of regulation that's been coming into play on forced labor, child labor. So the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australia Modern Slavery Act, the California Supply Chains Act. There's a lot happening beyond those examples where hopefully that it's showing in the data that they're actually it's not as prevalent as it was in the past. And then on the next slide, we look a little bit at sort of the evolution of some of these human rights issues and topics. So one thing we noticed is that over the last 5 years, incidents involving Indigenous people have been on the rise overall. And in the past few months, we've seen a rise of these incidents in certain Latin American countries, in Brazil and Mexico and in Guatemala. On the migrant labor side, so on the migrant labor topic, we also saw that there was a broad distribution of these risk incidents across many sectors. So some incidents are more prevalent in certain sectors, some issues. Here we see that it's across a lot of different sectors. And the country with the highest count of migrant labor incidents during this period was surprisingly, well, now Qatar, because it was all linked to the FIFA World Cup that's happening this year. So that was just something to mention. And then human trafficking is actually less common and seems to be on the decline, related to my point on the previous slide. But we've seen the frequency of these incidents in the travel and leisure sector also decrease over the past year. So I think there's a lot of ways to slice and dice the data. These are just some extracts, right? There's a lot of data to work with here. And we have data analysts who all they do is look at the data set. So if there are questions from the audience or something that you want to kind of look into or dig into, just feel free to contact us about that. And finally, on the next slide. So, I mean, this is something that we talk a lot about with our clients and with others. I mean, we talk about the interconnectivity of ESG. So that there are ESG incidents, ESG data, it's multidimensional, and you can't just neatly pack E issues or S issues into their respective pillars. And so here we see that in the data as well. So it's just proving, I think, what a lot of us have experienced already, but now we see it directly in the data. So a clear interconnectivity between the E, S, and G areas. So whether that's a mining project where that impacts the local community and so on and so forth. So, and just like we know that climate change is not just purely an E issue as well, that also has S implications. So I think those are just a couple data nuggets that we pulled out just to kind of, share with you. But again, we have a lot of different ways to look at the data and a lot of data to look at. So again, if there are specific questions, we're happy to address that from the audience or after the webinar.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. And I do encourage everyone to take a look at the report. There's a lot of information and data in all of this. And there have been some questions that came in. So please continue to ask them and we will get to them as soon as we can. And with that, I will turn this over to Talia.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Alexandra, for the very insightful presentation that I hope to complement, as I see our work very complementary. If we can move to just the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll start by giving a short introduction to the CHRB. Then we'll look at how we work with RepRisk on allegations against benchmark companies. And I'll finish with a few examples of how our benchmarks data has been used to drive change. So I'll start by the quick intro. So the CHRB was initially set up outside of the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is part of the Alliance right now, by a multi-stakeholder coalition composed of institutional investors, civil society organizations, independent business and human rights experts, and an ESG rating agency. So there was always close involvement of investors from the start. Some of the organizations involved were, for example, APG Asset Management, Aviva Investors, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and the IRIS Foundation, among others. The CHRB has been assessing human rights disclosures of some of the largest global companies across 5 sectors: food and agricultural products, extractives, ICT manufacturing, automotive manufacturing, and apparel. Since 2017. So again, it's one of the oldest WBA benchmarks with several years of data by now. So we're able to identify trends, track progress of companies and sectors, and see where gaps continue to exist. So as I mentioned, the CHRB looks at the policies, processes, and practices companies have in place to systematize their human rights approach and how they respond to serious allegations. The CHRB methodology includes approximately 50 indicators, including sector-specific indicators across the 5 measurement areas, which you can see on the slide on the right-hand side. An important point is that our methodology is grounded in the UNGPs, and other international human rights standards, some of them industry specific. It is also developed and updated through extensive global multi-stakeholder consultations to ensure that our methodology is up to date and in line with stakeholder expectations, remain relevant, rigorous. And for example, last year we went through a methodology review process and updated and added some new indicators to our methodology. Another thing to mention is that all WBA benchmarks are a public good for all stakeholders. The CHRB indicator requirements are made public and can therefore be used by companies and other stakeholders as a guide to focus on their actions and disclosures, regardless of whether they're in scope of our benchmark or not. And last, just a quick update, we're currently in the midst of a research cycle for the 5th iteration of the CHRB, and the 2022 benchmark will launch in November around the time of the UN Business and Human Rights Forum. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as mentioned, as part of the assessment, we look at serious allegations of negative human rights impacts. against companies. This measurement area is 20% of a company's overall score. We received these allegations from external sources such as print media, NGOs, news sites, and governmental agencies. We look at incidents covered by VGO IRIS, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and of course, RepRisk. And looking at allegations is very important to us because it allows us to look at sources beyond company self-reporting, as Alexandra mentioned just before, and get closer to impacts on the ground. And by incorporating RepRisk's data into the benchmark, we avoid the disclosure gap that occurs when we solely rely on company self-reporting. It's worth noting that we don't assess the allegation or incident itself, but rather how the company responded to the allegation. So how do we do that? Just a very quick overview. So RepRisk would provide us with cases of controversies, incidents. We see if these incidents meet our severity threshold. I won't go into detail, but we want to note that the incident is systemic and impacts a large number of the workforce. And we also check that it's in scope of the benchmark. We only look at upstream impacts. Then we assess how the companies responded to the allegations, essentially on 3 criteria. Rather, the company responded to the allegation publicly, rather the company investigated the incident and took steps to prevent reoccurrence of the incidents. And last, rather the company engaged with affected stakeholders and taking appropriate action to provide for or cooperate in remedy. I'll quickly go over what we found when we looked at allegations in the last benchmark, and you can see the image I have on the right-hand side of the slide. So the 2020 benchmark considered 225 serious allegations of human rights abuse that met the CHRB severity threshold. Out of those, out of the 230 companies we benchmarked, over 100 had at least one serious allegation connected to them. As the graph shows, the most common types of allegations related to instances of forced labor, health and safety, and child labor. I'm happy to move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I could go on allegations, but in the interest of not taking too much time, I will now move to discuss a few examples of how our benchmark results were used to drive change by different stakeholders. So first, companies. Our benchmark is used by the companies benchmark themselves. So since the first iteration of the CHRB that was published in 2017, we have seen clear company progress. So between 2017 to 2019, average scores for companies included in all 3 iterations of the benchmark increased from 18% to 31%, and 75 of companies improved their overall scores. So we do see this clear improvement over time. Maybe not enough, but it's something. We also know from our engagement with assessed companies that the benchmark provides them with tools to understand stakeholder expectations, identify the main gaps in their approach and disclosures, learn from their peers, and challenge themselves to improve over time. Another stakeholder using the benchmark results is investors. We know that the benchmark equips investors with data to inform their engagement with companies and encourage those who are not performing in line with international human rights standards to improve. This engagement occurs between individual investors and companies, but also through collective actions. One example is in 2020, a group of over 170 investors came together to co-sign a public letter that was sent to 95 companies that scored 0 on human rights due diligence in our 2019 benchmark results. The letter urged them to improve rapidly in time for progress to show in the next benchmark. The statement was reopened for new signatories to come on board when our 2020 results were published. And now we have over 200 financial institutions that are behind the statement, collectively representing $5.8 trillion in assets under management. The statement is targeting all companies that are still scoring 0 on human rights due diligence in the CHRB's 2020 benchmark. And the statement was used to send letters to all the companies with follow-up engagement between signatories and companies still ongoing. And we're still in touch with these investors and help them when they need to prepare for such engagements. I'll give another very quick example of how our data is being used by investors. So it's a very specific example of investor action facilitated by the benchmark data and leading to company change is the publication of Kraft Heinz first human rights policy in 2019, following shareholder resolutions referencing the company's CHRB results and requesting it to implement several changes. In addition to publishing a human rights policy, the company also committed to undertake human rights due diligence in line with the UNGPs. So we'll see how it improved this year. There are various other examples of how stakeholders use our benchmarks to drive impact, but I will share some links in the chat or answer any questions you might have later. And if interested, I'm happy to share my contact as well. So thank you, and I will hand it back to you, Gina.
All right, well, thank you. There is a question you can actually ask, Talia, and that is, and this came in from one of our participants, can companies opt in to the CHRB or are the benchmark companies set by the WBA?
It's a very good question. So WBA selected 2,000 companies that are in scope that are what we call is the SDG 2000, which are companies that we've identified as having the most influence to impact and create change over time. I'm happy to share the links of the specific criteria of how we included these companies, but an important point is that even if you're not in scope of the benchmark, we are very happy to answer questions about the requirements and the methodology, and everything that we do in terms of methodologies and public and scorecards is public. So we also want to have tools that companies could use even if they're not in scope of the benchmark. Another thing to mention is that we see our methodologies used by third parties. So there are some assessments conducted by asset managers using our methodologies to assess companies that they might want included in an investment portfolio. So there are many opportunities there, and I'm happy to provide more information on that.
Great, great. Well, we have about 20 minutes. Had some good questions, and we'll just get right into the Q&A. I'd like to start, Linda, let's start with you, and I'd like to talk about regulation. How can S data be reported in national and international regulation or legislation that require disclosure on S indicators? So whether we're talking about the UK and Australia's Modern Slavery Act, et cetera.
Thank you, Gina. I think the regulatory space has really changed very rapidly. When we work with White & Case, if you look at one of our annexes, Annex number 2 is actually a legal annex. And I believe that currently White & Case is updating it, because even within the space of 1 year, there have been a lot of changes. And I think that any kind of legislatory change will actually enable companies to start collecting this data. And let's not forget that there's also a very important regulatory development coming up, which is the EU social taxonomy, which will again try and push for some sort of standardization. And we have the International Sustainability Standards Board now working on alignment. And we do believe, and what we've seen and what we've heard this far, is that there is going to be a greater push for some sort of alignment and standardization. And in this space, this kind of push will actually generate the need to comply, which then generates data. And also, once you have these compliance questions, I believe that it will also create a bit of a pressure on the data providers, which is great, because as Alexandra showed us, how you approach it is that, well, I love the fact that RepRisk, for example, discloses the methodology. And I think this is the way forward. We really need to enter not the race to the bottom, but race to the top. So we actually do need to dig deeper and find out all these different additional data points. And I think legislation and regulation in this space will be driving additional indicators and additional better understanding of where we have these weaknesses. And also, let's not forget that there's going to be delegated acts for the taxonomy, and there's going to be follow-up legislation. So this space will keep getting hotter, let's put it that way. So you will need teams and you will need expertise to ensure that you're complying, and also to ensure that you know what you're doing and how to do it once it becomes mandatory. We saw that with the green taxonomy. It was the same thing. People didn't believe that it's going to go through. It did go through. And now you have to report. And it's so much easier if you've already started the journey rather than left it till last minute. And then it's much more expensive as well from a business perspective.
And maybe I can add one thing to that, Gina. I think one thing that we've been following closely, this is also recent development, right? The EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, right? So I think now there's been a lot of regulation. The first wave of regulations have been about disclosures, reporting, and I think that's critically important because you can't improve things that you can't see and measure. So that's a good first step. But some of these, the recent developments on the due diligence requirements, and that's also part of the a lot of the different regulations that are out there now, also in Germany, France, and in the Netherlands. This requirement for due diligence, right? So actually showing that you do something, right? That you reporting is the first step, and then you say, okay, I actually have to show that I'm looking at environmental issues and human rights. And I was very happy to see human rights as part of that directive. So I think there's a lot happening in that space as well, where companies, where disclosure is not going to be enough anymore. They have to show that they do something.
Well, I think that's a really good segue into just the idea of applicability. And Alexandra, since we're chatting with you, I'll stick with you for a moment. And when we talk about the applicability of this data, can you share some more examples for us on how it's being used?
Sure. So we actually have a couple of examples that we have some visuals just to kind of bring some color to the examples that I'm going to share. So before I start, I think the key thing that I always like to mention is that no matter what, we work with a variety of different clients, banks and asset managers, pension funds, corporates, also nonprofit organizations, right? Think tanks. But I think all of our clients or partners come to us for the same thing, because we help them to identify, assess, and monitor ESG risks in their organization, in their business, in their investments. So regarding the applicability question, so Gina, so let me give you a few examples. So one is one of our oldest clients is the Norwegian Global Pension Fund. So they are the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. We've been working with them since back in 2009. And what we do for them is on a regular basis, they gave us their portfolio of 9,000 companies, and we provide a customized report to them, which shows them, according to their specific ESG criteria, what are the companies that are in potential violation of their ethical standards and criteria. So they have a focus on environmental issues, so severe environmental issues, severe human rights abuses, and severe cases of corruption. And so so that we provide them this data into a report that is then used by the Council on Ethics to investigate further, to then provide a recommendation to the Ministry of Finance, who then decides if there's a divestiture, or if they divest from a particular company, or if they make a change in how they weigh a certain company in their portfolio. So that is one way. And then another example is from one of our first client, actually. UBS is our very first client, and we've been working with them from the beginning, so 15 years. Today we work with over 85 banks around the world. And what happened in 2011 is that UBS integrated our data into their global compliance system. So they have a global compliance system that looks that, all major transactions, clients, suppliers are pulled in through this global compliance system. And there's multiple checks that are part of that compliance system. But for the environmental and social part, we provide them with a data feed. So we feed their internal tool with a customized data set. So we have 101 risk factors, ESG risk factors that we cover. And they've outlined, okay, out of those 101, what is in scope for them according to their policies at UBS. And then we feed them that data, and it includes data on human rights. And then they use that information to screen everything that goes through that compliance system. So when there is a company or a transaction or a supplier that has a high risk, it gets flagged as part of that daily screening, and then it gets passed to a specialist team who's responsible for doing the enhanced due diligence. So actually going into our database and looking at the profile, and then engaging with the relevant stakeholders internally and externally. And they're one of the several clients who customize the data. So again, you can decide, how to slice and dice the data to fit your risk appetite and your criteria and policies, basically. And the last example, quickly. So this is a client we unfortunately cannot name, but it's a large industrial engineering firm, and they built an in-house human rights due diligence tool. So, it's a software that they've developed for, to basically help them look at the ESG risks, but especially the human rights risks across the countries where they operate, across their own operations, suppliers, partners, and so on. And we feed them with a variety of data on everything from labor relations to modern slavery and other. So we mapped their scope to our scope, and then we feed their human rights due diligence tool and scorecard. So these are 3 examples from 3 different type of clients and industries, but you'll see the theme. I mean, from the 3 examples, it's always about risk identification, risk assessments, and again, there's always ways to slice and dice the data to meet a specific need or use case.
Yeah, and this is just a lot of data, and it's really powerful how you're able to bring it all together for each, like you showed, each individual client that you're working with and the different ways you use it. So I think a follow-up question then on that is, when we're talking about really complex remote supply chains, how can S issues be identified and monitored in those situations?
Yeah, so I think it's the same. So our approach to our research is the same, no matter if a client is a buyer, a supplier, if a company is large or small, no matter what country or sector it operates in. We always have that same rules-based methodology. And I think when it comes to supply chain, the idea is that supply chains are very, very large, usually for large multinational companies. So where we can help is basically triaging the supply chain. So helping to identify out of a large supply chain, where are the potential pockets of risk, where are the potential risky suppliers, and then when those are identified, they can, whenever it's needed, they can then use the data that we provide to decide, okay, are we going to engage with a supplier? Are we going to audit a supplier? So basically helping to use resources more efficiently, because it's often overwhelming to manage, to do risk management in a large supply chain. One thing that we've developed years ago that I think is also useful for supply chain is that there's millions of companies out there, right? At RepRisk, we love to say, oh, we have the largest data set. Yes, that's true, but there's millions and millions of companies, and a lot of tier 2, 3, 4, 5 suppliers are small companies that may not be in the radar where our methodology would find something. So what we developed was a country sector analysis tool. So in case you can't find the data on one, you have something, so we can share a slide on that. So it's basically a tool where you can pick the country and then overlay a sector, and then see the ESG risk at the intersection of that country and sector. So even in absence of data on one specific company, there's still some data that you can use to get an idea of what the risks are, to engage, to do a risk assessment, and so on. So I think the supply chain is not an easy area, but I think there's still a lot of data where you can start to do a lot to identify the risky areas and how to deploy resources efficiently.
Talia, anything else you wanted to add on the idea of remote supply chains? I mean, it is a very tricky scenario.
Yeah, just to add to what Alexandra said, I think what RepRisk is doing is so fantastic, because when it comes to complex supply chains, the first step is identifying where the highest risk is. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly the first steps for investors, for example, to first identify where the highest risk is, and then dive into assessing those risks and deciding what actions they would take to mitigate those risks. So yeah, nothing really to add. I think that was well presented, but just to say how important that is as a first step and what an essential tool this is.
Another question that just actually came in, and it's on, to what extent does RepRisk take the whole value chain of the company into account? And I think the reason that this came up is what you mentioned earlier about why child labor was lower on the relevance or ranking that you mentioned earlier.
So the way that it works is, so we take the same approach for every company. So the way that it works is that when we're looking for info, so I'm just taking a step back and talking about the methodology for a second so I can answer it. So we're looking for information that links a company or an infrastructure project to one of the 101 ESG risk factors in our research scope. So that's the baseline criteria to be in our data set. And then once we actually pull an incident to be analyzed, we then tag in that particular incident, okay, it's a story about a mining company in this country, but maybe there's multiple mining companies, maybe there's multiple issues or sub-stories that mentions a supplier or another project operator or a bank or an asset manager. So all of those, the companies that are mentioned in that specific incident are tagged to that incident and are analyzed individually so that we don't lock them all together into one risk story. So it's so you can really, it's very, I'm looking for the word now, but I can't find it, very specific to that specific company, right? So they're linked to the right issue. So the question about the whole value chain, so we map company structures in the back end, so you can see, we know what companies link to a certain subsidiaries or parent companies, but the value chain itself, if we're talking about the supply chain or so I think that is a very tricky, I don't know if they're referring to the supply chain or just to the sort of company structure. But the company structure we map on the back end to make sure that subsidiaries are linked to their parents and to the ultimate owners. Even that in and of itself, identifying companies and linking them directly is a very tricky thing. It's not an easy task to undertake or to maintain. But I think the answer to the question is essentially, if the company is mentioned in that incident, it is analyzed specifically, and then the relationship is made clear in the back end.
Now, maybe Linda, this will be a question for you, and then I'd love to hear what others think as well. But a question came in around, are there indicators and benchmarking tailored to health services, considering their core business in the S of ESG? And so I'm wondering, is there anything specific in the report, the myths report that you put out, that is specific to the health services industry, or is there more data out there that would be specific that you can tailor? So curious your thoughts.
Thank you, Gina. I think what we tried to do with the paper was we didn't actually go down sector per sector. So we tried to take a bird's eye view of what are the systematically important impact indicators, regardless of where you are located or what sector, because there are some things that are definitely material everywhere. So that is living wage, that is basic human rights, so on and so forth. However, to have those meaningful material indicators that are salient, that might affect the performance of the company and so on and so forth, you do have to actually look sector per sector. And that is a very important thing, even geography per geography, if you want to be even more precise. So what we discovered is that actually in different geographies, different S indicators hold bigger weight in terms of determining whether the company will be hit with lawsuits, whether it's going to suffer reputational risk. What we also thought was very interesting, that while reputational risk was seen as maybe initially a few years ago, a little bit of a less risky thing, we actually heard from some big investors saying, well, it happens, but then, a couple of years later, you're back to normal. It's not a big deal. But actually, I think what's happening is that now with the kind of media and info space that we have, it's not that simple. It can really stick. That reputational risk can hurt you over a much, much longer run. And that is a very interesting development in this space. In terms of health sector in particular, we didn't do a deep dive on that. But from what I know, there are several initiatives, both in the US and in Europe, that do look sector per sector. So if there is interest in finding these particular indicators, that is possible. And I can't remember right now what exactly the academics and the studies were, but there's definitely material out there if you search for it. And that's also one of the things that we would like to encourage, is go and look for the information. reach out beyond the obvious places, right? Because there's so many initiatives we discovered that are doing amazing things and can be very, very useful. So don't just go to the usual suspects, but also read up on it and try to search for the expertise.
Talia, anything else to add on the health services piece?
No. I think it's good.
Got it. And Alexandra, anything else on that as well? I think that's such an important issue. Right. Yeah, I agreed. I think it's about, there is information out there, finding that information. But at this moment, this specific report is more of a higher level view, but it's packed with very good information. We have a few more minutes, so we can probably do 1 to 2 more questions here. I'd like to actually move to innovation and ask you about what is the state of the data industry today? Where is innovation coming from? And Alexandra, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think, with the technological advances, I think it makes data a very exciting space, right? So AI is now everywhere, right? You can't turn anywhere these days without hearing AI being applied to anything and everything. One of the things that we've been working on, I think is also very exciting from the new data sets that are empowered or available because of technological advances is geospatial data. So satellite data, remote sensing data. This is something that we started working on back in 2019. We were mapping gas projects so taking their GPS coordinates and mapping it to, in this case, environmentally sensitive areas. So like World Heritage sites and other protected areas. Now, for the moment, as in our experience of working on this project the last few years, the E is easier to tackle, but there is an idea of looking at the S as well. You could map conflict areas. There's different ways to map data also in the S pillar, which is something that we're definitely going to look at once we roll out the first go of this geospatial data later. We're actually in the process of rolling out a beta to a few clients now. So I think there's a lot of different ways to apply the data. Part of it is, again, making sense of the data is I think part of the challenge, right? And having a use case that's clear and a methodology that's transparent. It's something that I say 1,000 times, but it's so important because otherwise people are just drowning in data. And if you can't apply it, then it doesn't really help.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we have about 1 minute left. And so what I'd like to do before we end is just give you the floor and any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with, any takeaways. Linda, we'll start with you. Anything you want folks to remember as they're walking away today?
Thank you, Gina. I think that the main message is this is doable and it is absolutely necessary. And for risk mitigation, and also for finding the best opportunities, it will become absolutely crucial. It cannot be overlooked, especially in an economy where most of your assets are intangible. So it's human assets, it's human resources. So in that sense, I think we really need to pay attention. And I think that the last question that Eraldo has put in there, have we actually looked at political polarization? We have actually at ISFC, and we think that the political polarization will actually drive huge amounts of reputational risk and potentially eat into profit margins unless you're very careful, because it can be weaponized. So in that sense, definitely it will have an impact. So to find at least a little bit of peace of mind in an uncertain and volatile world, I would say that these are definitely crucial issues to look at. And data is just a fantastic thing to also use for that. And RepRisk is showing that it is possible and it's very doable and it's actually useful.
Talia, any final words from you?
So I guess from a human rights perspective, you have to remember that we look at risk to people and not risk to business, and that the data is out there, but each financial institution has to have an approach that it takes to maybe use the data, but also develop an approach on how to conduct this due diligence. It's just part of the puzzle. It's not the whole picture.
All right, Alexandra, final words.
Well, I mean, I thought I had I already said my key point, I think, before about the use case and the fact that, the data is there. It's there also for private companies. It's there for supply chain. It's there for emerging and frontier markets. So no excuses. The data is there. It may not be, people have to start somewhere. So yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a very, very illuminating conversation. I thank all of you for the work you're doing. It is tremendous. Please keep doing it. Thank you to everyone for joining, for listening to this webinar. Please do check out the links that were put in the chat. You'll have access to the paper as well. But that's it. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe out there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.